Now we're talking about the types of selection, the three main kinds of selection, and this is depending on the effect that they will have on the shape of the populations. We have disruptive selection, where you start out with a nice bell curve population, and disruptive selection will now split that population into two main peaks. So that's why it's called disruptive, because you take a nicely bell-shaped population and you split it into almost two populations. On the other hand, directional selection, you start with a bell curve population and you shift that population in one direction, so that the mean, which used to be here around 75, now you have a mean located at around 100. So you've pushed that population in one direction. Stabilizing selection, you start with a bell curve population, and now instead of pushing them in one direction, you're pushing it towards the center. So you're sort of squeezing the population, and now the dispersal that you started with, somewhere the range between 25 and 125, now your range is much smaller. Your range between somewhere around 30 and 100. So you squeeze in the individuals in the population and you're favoring those at the middle. An example of stabilizing selection is, for instance, weight at birth. So babies that have the weight at birth that is near the mean are more likely to survive, while those who have either very low weight or very high weight will have more problems and higher mortality. So those in the middle would have the lowest mortality, and those will be the ones more favored, and actually those are the most common weights that you find at birth. So there is this narrowing of the distribution. Another example is the wings in birds. If the wings get too long, now it's very hard for the birds to maneuver, but if the wings get too short, now they become very inefficient. So bird wings will have stabilizing selection, in which you want to get the right balance between having very long wings that are hard to maneuver versus very short wings that are very inefficient, and you will get pushed to have somewhere in the middle. Directional selection is when we're favoring traits in a specific direction. Like you're always going for, in this case, this is an example of an artificial experiment where flies were selected for their preference for the light. But you can have many other types of directional selection. Like, for example, when we selected corn, we selected for higher number of corn kernels. So over time, the generation after generation of corn plants will have higher and higher number of corn kernels. Another example of directional selection recently was noticed. Its studies show that the Dutch population have been under strong sexual selection for tallness, and that explains why the Dutch are so tall, because the females prefer tall men, and over time, generation after generation, tall men have been favored, and they've had more offspring, and the population has become taller. An example of disruptive selection, this is when individuals in the middle of the distribution are selected against, is this case of the finches, where you either have a large beak so that you can manipulate large seeds, or you have a small beak where you can manipulate small seeds. If you have somewhere in the middle, you're not good at either one, and you will be less likely to get enough food so that you can have enough offspring, so your genes will over time become less common. But if you have larger beaks, then you will be better at getting food from large seeds, so you have more offspring. And if you have small beaks, the same thing, so you'll be more likely to get small seeds and you'll have more offspring. So this is a way of disrupting the population, because we started with a nice uniform population, and now we're starting to have two separate populations. This is a very important type of selection in separating traits in a species. So this could lead to two completely different populations, and eventually even two completely different species. Here we're going to see examples of where selection can change over time. The direction of selection changes over time. In frequency-dependent selection, the direction of the selection depends on how frequent that genotype is in the population. And it can either be negative, so that the more frequent you are, the less likely you are to survive, or positive, so that the more common you are, the more likely you will survive. Or on the other hand, oscillating selection is when the direction of selection is also changing directions, but does not depend on how frequent that genotype is. And finally, the heterozygous advantage is when heterozygotes are favored over homozygous dominant or recessive, and this can stabilize the genotype of the population by favoring heterozygous even though the homozygous traits or a particular allele is not favored over the other. So an example of negative frequency dependent selection, this is when the more common your genotype becomes, the less likely you are to pass on. So for example, in this water bugs, the more common they become, the more likely that predators will eat them, so that they won't be able to pass on the genes. And those that are rare will be able to pass by and not be detected by the predators and slowly start to increase in frequency. So frequency dependent selection is when your chances of surviving depend on whether you have the common genotype or the rare genotype. The opposite of negative frequency dependent selection is positive frequency dependent. Here is when you have the common genotype, you are more likely to survive. So in this fish, for instance, if you look like all the other fish, you will be more likely to survive. But if you stand out, now you will become a target for the predators. So in that case, if you have the common genotype, you're more likely to survive. If you have the rare genotype, you will be less likely to survive. On the other hand, oscillating selection is when the direction of selection is changing depending on the environment. In the Galapagos, for example, you have times where you have droughts and you have times where there is a lot of rain. And when there is a lot of rain, you have more small seeds produced. And this favors the finches with the small beaks that can manipulate and eat those small seeds better. So in rainy seasons, in rainy years, you will have more of these small beak finches favored. And when you have droughts, now most of the seeds produced are large, and you will favor the large finches. So the difference between this and the previous frequency dependent selection is that in this case, it doesn't depend on how common each genotype is. So it doesn't matter how many small beak finches there were, but it just depends on the environment. So some years favor the small beaks and some years favor the large beaks, and this has nothing to do with how common large beaks are over small beaks, but it depends on what is the weather like that year. Another example of oscillating selection is when the white moths were favoring clean environments, and then when you have pollution, the dark moths are favored, and if you go again to clean air, now the white moths are favored again. So this direction of selection is changing, and it's because the environment is changing.